Okay, this is the most exciting chapter, I have to tell you, because we've now, again, remember, we've gone through a big chunk of the L narrative and the birth narratives, the sermon at Nazareth, the little story of Peter on the ocean, a bunch of stuff in Luke 6. We watched as he calls the disciples and then he gives them that didache. After that calling, gives them that didache, that substratum. Then we saw in chapter 7 and 8 this plethora of miracles and exorcisms that happen with a little teaching sprinkled in and some parables. But it's primarily this catena of exorcisms and healings that take place in chapters 7, 8, and also now chapter 9. Okay, so we want to watch now what happens in chapter 9, because there's a remarkable turn of events. And so if you have a Bible, please turn to Luke chapter 9, because I want to highlight a few things looking at the narrative as a whole before we start breaking it down into the individual pericope. So after you have this second raising from the dead, you had the widow's son, then you had Jairus's daughter. Jesus calls the 12 together, gives them power and authority over all demons and to cure diseases. Notice that, both things. Gives them authority over the demonic and over disease. And he sent them out to preach the kingdom of God and to heal. And he said to them, take nothing for your journey, no staff, nor bag, nor bread, nor money. Do not even have 2 tunics. That is, just go completely impoverished here. Whatever house you enter, stay there, and from there depart. And wherever they do not receive you, when you leave that town, shake off the dust from your feet as a testimony against them. And they departed and went through the villages, preaching the gospel and healing everywhere. But by the way, this phrase, as a testimony against them, this is the use of martureo here now. Same as we saw that negative witness, the people witnessed against Jesus in the synagogue. Same thing here. You witness against them. Now, the next little narrative is a story about Herod thinking John the Baptist has been raised from the dead, and then we come to the feeding of the 5,000. Then Peter's declaration about Jesus, then the transfiguration. And then the narrative concludes, interestingly enough, this section, I should say, this chapter, with the healing of a boy with an unclean spirit. And there's going to be something real significant about this text that really opens up for us what's really going on in chapter 9. Jesus, for the second time in this chapter, is going to foretell his death. Then there's an argument about who's the greatest among them. And then finally, there's this little saying about a strange exorcist. And all of this leads up now to chapter 9, verse 51, where Jesus is going to set his face like flint to Jerusalem. And from 951 all the way to 1914, it's like he goes in a straight line down to Jerusalem, and then he's there, and then the Passion narrative, etc. So whereas Matthew and Mark continue to have Jesus working a Galilean ministry and then eventually heading down south, Luke here has him just beelining straight through. But I want you to notice something here. In the first text, Jesus gives them power to heal and to cast out demons. These are 2 sides of the same coin. Okay? Now, remember, let's go to the end of the narrative. Look at verse 37. After all this stuff in the middle's happened, we're going to come back to this. We're going to weave in and out of this. Verse 37, he comes off a mountain. A man from the crowd says, Teacher, I beg you, look on my son. He's my only child. And behold, a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly cries out. It convulses him till he foams and shatters him and will hardly leave him. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. What had happened? What had happened from the beginning of the chapter when they had authority to cast out demons and heal diseases? and this text, where they appear no longer to have any authority. And at that point, verse 41, Jesus says, "O faithless and perverse generation, how long am I to be with you and bear with you?" And who's he talking about here? Who is he referring? Who's this faithless and perverse generation? And then, of course, Jesus will go on to heal this young boy. Now, there is this. I don't know again if I'm seeing stuff that's not there, but it seems to me that what we're dealing with here narratively in the structure of the narrative again has fundamentally to do with this message that's very, very different. The Father of Jesus, this message of the reign of God that Jesus announces, is so fundamentally different from that which had been preached and taught and everything else previously, that the rejection that he's experiencing, both on the road, but interestingly enough, from his own disciples. I want you to watch what happens here. And we're going to bring a little bit of mimetic theory to help clarify this. So in chapter 9, verses 1 through 6, when he tells them, go out, cast out demons, heal diseases, he tells them not to take anything. Okay? Now, this is where Luke and Mark are going to be a bit different. Mark says he charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff. Matthew has changed that to take no gold, nor silver, no copper, no bag, 2 tunics, nor sandals, nor a staff. Matthew's changed that. Don't take your staff. Don't, he's got them stripped down to the bare minimum. And Luke says, take nothing for your journey, no staff. Now, why is this staff thing important? Why have Matthew and Luke omitted the staff that Mark includes in his narrative? Can that be an important clue as to something? I really think it can. What is a staff used for? A staff is used for protective measures. A wolf in the night, a bandit on the road. When Jesus counsels them to take no staff in the Matthean and Lucan narrative. Now, again, how about the historical Jesus, you might ask? Did they really carry a staff? Did they carry a staff? In the Markan narrative, the focus isn't on this issue of personal protection. Whereas in Matthew and Luke, it is. You don't even take anything to protect yourself. You have nothing. You go with zero, trusting the Father the whole time. You have authority to do 2 things. You can heal people and you can cast out evil spirits from people. And that's all you need. So there is no staff in Matthew and Luke. Now, if a staff is going to represent personal protection, Jesus doesn't have to tell them, leave behind your swords. They're already, that's presumed here. They are taking nothing for offense and nothing for defense when they go out on this journey. But when they come back from this journey, when they come back and now what's the first thing they're going to do? They're going to put their watch on. They're going to put their wallet in their pocket. They're going to put their favorite baseball cap on. They're back home again. They're going to put their sword on. They're going to get their dagger and they're going to strap it on. Now, what again gives me this clue? Well, first of all, we know at the end of the gospel narrative, Peter's still carrying a sword, and so I'm sure are the zealots, Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, if not others. And so you have this acceptance in the beginning of the narrative of the Father's protection, but as soon as they come back, that piece is given up. That's why at the end of this narrative, when they go to cast out demons, they fail because they have picked up violence again. And violence casts out violence is Satan casting out Satan. It doesn't work that way, because if you mentally come back and you go from the Father's going to protect me to I'm going to protect myself with a little violence if I need to, you have now doomed yourself, because you are not anywhere near strong enough to handle the, quote, violence of the demonic, the satanic realm. They'll wipe you out. And there's a story in the book of Acts about how that happens to exactly that happens to a guy. Okay. So the point that I'm making here is, between the beginning and the end of their narrative, these disciples still hadn't got it. And how do we know this? Well, when we go to the middle of the narrative, and we'll come back to Herod in a second. When we go to the middle of the narrative, just after the feeding of the 5,000, immediately when Jesus wants to know who he is, Peter identifies Jesus as this Davidic warlord. And Jesus just shuts him down. And for the first time, and then the second time in this chapter, he's going to say, I have to tell you something. The first time he says, the Son of Man is going to be rejected. And then he goes on to say, if you're going to follow me, this is the path you're taking. And then the second time around, he's going to say, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men. And Luke records they did not understand the saying. We'll come back to that. But here you have Jesus twice in this short narrative, immediately talking about the Son of Man, who will die, who will not protect himself. In other words, he's about to take this journey to Jerusalem, and his journey already has been this, but he's about to take this journey to Jerusalem just like the disciples did. No bag, one tunic, no staff, no knife, no sword. This is Jesus. Completely left himself in the care of the Father as he begins this journey. So how else do we know that we're dealing with violence here in the text? What's another indicator that we're dealing with something that has to do with this otherworldly message that's related to this? Well, on the Mount of Transfiguration, the two figures that appear are Elijah and Moses. And we both know what those figures were like. Not only were they great figures in Jewish history, but they were both very violent men. They used violence, okay? They were still locked into that God concept. Now, here's what's really fascinating. If you look in verse 30, it says, behold, two men talked with Jesus, Moses and Elijah, who appeared in glory. They all appear. So here's the three disciples, and then all of a sudden, bada boom, bada bing, there's these two guys and Jesus all dazzling in white light and stuff. And they recognize that's Moses and that's Elijah. Somehow they recognize them. I don't know. Maybe they had little Kodak pictures. I don't know. And at any rate, it says they spoke of his departure. Now, the English translations will often say they spoke of his death. Okay, this is cool. You've got the law and the prophets talking to Jesus about his death. So maybe Luke is trying to tell us here that Jesus' death fulfills the law and the prophets. Except that there is a bat kol and a cloud, the voice from heaven, the bat kol, and the cloud that descend. And the cloud says, listen to him, not to Moses, not to Elijah. Listen to my son. What were they talking about? It says they were talking about his exodus. Moses led an exodus, right? Elijah didn't, but Moses did. And what's the difference between the way Moses led his exodus and the way Jesus led his exodus? Both of them led to death. Moses' exodus led to the death of others. Jesus' exodus brings death straight to himself, not to others. So that's another clue. Then we have, after the sending of this group of disciples, after we have the sending of the group of disciples, then what do we have next? This little story about Herod's anxiety. And Herod's going, gosh, I wonder, is this John the Baptist whom I beheaded? And that little section there about who, when Herod's wondering, who is this Jesus, is just a little prelude to when Jesus is going to say a little bit later, who do people say I am and who do you say I am? What is this whole perception thing that's going on? Because what had happened, or what's going to happen here after this little piece about Herod, is the feeding of the 5,000. Now, it's in the Gospel of John that the feeding of the 5,000 leads the crowd to say, let us make him king. So both the Lucan and the Johannine narratives tie the feeding of the 5,000 miracle to the problematic of the true king of Israel. Who's the true king? Is it Herod or is it Jesus? And thus Jesus demand that they leave the area, they leave the crowds behind. He's just not going to have anything to do with them again, not the crowds. Not going to have anything to do with that Davidic warrior messiahship they want. He's not putting himself in competition with Herod. He leaves. And we see him at that point saying, I have to tell you in the most straight up way who I am as the true human, the ho huios tu anthropou, bar nashar, bar Adam, son of man, and what's going to happen to me. I'm going to tell you exactly what's going to be coming down the pike here. And what's really interesting is after the second time this saying is introduced in Luke, we have it once there at Caesarea Philippi, and then once again after the casting out of the demon that the disciples couldn't. It says, Jesus said, let these words sink into your ears. The Son of Man is to be delivered into the hands of men. And then Luke records, and only Luke, but they did not understand this saying. Now, we recall from the Gospel of John, the writer will say that too several times. They didn't understand at the time, okay? They did not understand this saying, and Luke says, it was concealed from them, that they should not perceive it. And they were afraid to ask him about it. Whatever this saying meant, they could not conceive in their minds that Jesus would allow himself to be killed. They're not making the identification of Jesus with the Son of Man at this point. He's just simply talking about the Son of Man. His favorite self-designation. You'd have thought they might have picked up on this before, but they hadn't. They hadn't made that connection. Okay, so let's look back through now and let's just follow some of the more interesting things in this text. So in the mission of the 12, he tells them, don't take anything, and when they leave, shake the dust off their feet, because they've the message about the reign of God and God's nonviolence has not been heard. Herod gets nervous. Jesus feeds the 5,000. Peter does his little declaration about who Jesus is. Jesus corrects him. And then we now have a very important piece on discipleship here. After the first correction in this narrative, Jesus says, if any man would come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And I've argued before, Taking up a cross daily means forgiving everybody daily, all day long. You're forgiving those who hurt you and say unkind things because they don't know what they're doing. Then Jesus said, whoever would save his life will lose it. This has nothing to do with justification by works. This has everything to do with he that would use violence to save his life will lose it. And whoever loses his life by refusing to be violent, for my sake, will save it. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world? How do you gain the whole world? Through force and violence, but loses or forfeits himself. And then you have the astonishing, for whoever is ashamed of me and my message. Whoever is ashamed of me, the way I'm behaving, and my message about the Father and the way the Father behaves, of him will the Son of Man be ashamed when he comes in glory and the glory of the Father and the holy angels. It does not say they will be damned or condemned, but they will be shamed. I tell you truly, there are some standing here, he says, who won't see death before they see the reign of God. And bang, that next immediate narrative, they go up the mountain, Jesus is transfigured, and again, the hermeneutic principle is established. Jesus alone, not the law and the prophets and Jesus, like in Matthew, not the law and the prophets and Jesus, like in Matthew, but Jesus alone. And by the way, I shouldn't lead you to think that Matthew says the law that they were just to. I've got to get over to Luke 9 here. Matthew isn't the only one to say he doesn't say listen to all three of them. He has listened to Jesus too. But we know from previously in Matthew's gospel that the law and the prophets were up to John, and then after John, the new dispensation. We know that for Matthew, the law and the prophets, not a jot or a tittle will fall from them until all things are fulfilled. We know Jesus did not come to destroy the law and the prophets, to fulfill them. Luke has none of that. It's just listen to him. I've already mentioned in the healing of the boy of the unclean spirit what I really thought was significant, because you can look at the commentaries and there's a lot of why couldn't the disciples? Well, they lost their faith, or they lacked faith, or they weren't strong. Whatever reason you want to give, the text gets psychologized or spiritualized. But if in fact the staff represents self-protection, and thus a form of the use of force, even for self-protection, or if the staff could possibly be used as an offensive weapon. I mean, you hit somebody in the head with a staff, you can crack their skull and kill them. But the point is that you have in the first narrative, the sending of the 12, that again, complete inability to retaliate in any way, shape, or fashion, except to wipe the dust from your feet. They're not going to be part of your memory. They're not part of your collective journey. They didn't hear it. That's on them. You move on. Now, further proof that we're dealing with this, and the disciples don't get it, is that even after Jesus heals this young boy, he again foretells his death, and we've already been over this. And then there's this silly argument that breaks out amongst them about who was the greatest. Now, you have to think about this for a second, okay? We are now being clued in that everything in here is about mimesis and the problem of mimesis, not just simply violence, but mimesis itself. Who is the greatest? I'm better than you. I'm better than you. Jesus let me do this. Yeah, well, Jesus let me do that. And I'm older than you. And yeah, but all the reasons, they're all sitting around saying why they're the best of the best, okay? What's happening here is a mimetic conflict is being stirred up. Okay? They all are focused on who's number two. And they've all forgotten that no matter who's number two, there's still a number one above them. But they're battling for that second position. That's when Jesus takes a child, says, okay, here's how it works. Whoever receives this child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives the one who sent me. So this reception of the child is now is tied to the reception of the sender. Now, you might say to yourself, oh, yeah, who wouldn't welcome a little child at that point, right? But you live in the 21st century. Okay, you need to drop your thinking back a good 100 years, and you can just go back through history when children were nothing but burdens on parents. That's what they were, unless they were working the farms, of course. Okay, but the point is that children are to be seen, not heard. Children are, they're a burden. You have to take care of them. You have to watch over them. You have to care for them. Jesus says, if you take this child in my name and you care for them, then you're the greatest of all. That's what the greatest of all does, he says. Whoever receives me receives the one who sent me, for he who is least among you is the one that's great. That is, Jesus is flipping mimetic rivalry on its head and turning it into a competition now for who can be the most receptive, the most open, the most generous, okay? The most humble, and not in a self-flattering way, but in an authentic way. He flips the whole script. Again, they don't get it. Okay, so if nobody amongst them is greater, surely they as a group of 12 are greater than the rest of the people, right? So John replied to that, Lord, we saw a man casting out demons in your name, and we forbade him because he does not follow with us. Okay, you see the logic here? First, who's the greatest among them? Jesus reverses that, says, okay, you guys get this thing all wrong. So John says, okay, if there's no greatest here among us, we're still greater than everybody outside, right? And we saw this guy casting out demons in your name, and we stopped him. We just told him, you can't do that. You can't use that name. That's the name that was given to us. That back in chapter 9, verses 1-6, man. We have the rights to that name. And Jesus says, don't forbid him. Whoever's not against you is for you. Now, think about this. They had just gone through the experience of not being able to cast out demons in Jesus' name. Here comes a strange exorcist who is able to cast out demons in Jesus' name. The text doesn't tell you this unless you pay attention to the difference between the exorcism story and that first narrative. What is it that this strange exorcist had obviously embraced? He embraced nonviolence. He would not use violence. Violence could not be a part of his way of life, and therefore he has authority over violence, the satanic, the demonic. Now, at this point, we're going to move into the travel narrative. And next week, I'm going to give you some schematic diagrams of a breakdown of the travel narrative. In this narrative, and if you want to try and read it, you'll read from 951 to 1914. I believe it is 19. Hang on. Get you the exact text. Yeah. 1910, and then they get near Jerusalem. Okay, so 951 through 1910 is this travel narrative, and in this narrative, Mark is going to be left entirely. The only material in this narrative is going to be found from Matthew and Luke's special source, L, or as I've suggested, potentially the Hebrew gospel. And Luke is going to weave this narrative. He's going to use if Kenneth Bailey is correct on this, and I think I'll be able to demonstrate that next week. I think it's a very, very, very fascinating approach to this. You have a chiastic structure built into this narrative. Furthermore, it's in this narrative that Luke is going to begin to reprise a whole bunch of themes from the book of Deuteronomy about the prophet like Moses, whom they are to hear. That's that little transfiguration narrative. I will send another prophet like you, whom they will listen to. And he's going to weave four major themes from this Deuteronomic story into Jesus' travel narrative, where Jesus is the rejected prophet, just as Moses had been rejected. And we're going to see now in this travel narrative a lot of teaching. That is, as Jesus is taking his journey of discipleship and he's living out the substratum that he gave to them in chapter 6, he's also going to be teaching them about a lot of different things, from prayer to the reign of God to the character of God, and so on and so forth. But we'll look at that narrative when we get to it next week. Suffice it to say that this narrative begins in a most interesting fashion. It begins by Jesus sending messengers ahead of him. And they entered a village of the Samaritans to make ready, and the people would not receive him because his face was set for Jerusalem. In other words, they heard Jesus is coming, but he's on his way to Jerusalem. That's like saying Jesus is coming to you, but he's got to go to the big guns. You're just a little stop on the way. They were feeling slighted. And you'll notice that the disciples, James and John, want to bring fire from heaven down on them like it's Sodom and Gomorrah. Again, this is another indication that they're thinking incorrectly. So Jesus has to rebuke them, just like he rebukes the demons. But they are locked into that notion that God is violent. Had he not just taught them, when you leave a village, if you're not received, wipe the dust off your feet, they want to turn this village into dust. This is how little they were getting this whole time. And at this point, then, Jesus is going to begin to talk to them about discipleship and what it means to be a disciple. But we'll hold that off for next week, and I will end the lesson at this point.